Hello. A very good morning, everyone. Okay. So, before the panel starts, it's a 5-minute slides on a little introduction about what are submarine cables and how the infrastructure looks like. So, a little about me. It doesn't change. Okay. So, I'm Rupesh Mittal. I'm from India. I run a non-profit organization named Cyber Jagrati Foundation. We work on digital empowerment. So, I have been in this field for the past 8 years. Empowering people, more of students on how to digitally connect with people safely. Okay. A lot of stuff I do, but we'll talk about that sometime later. So I'm not sure how many of you know that, but it's a show, biggest show of India. I've been featured on that. I write a lot about how to safely use internet and lot. One of the biggest achievements of mine is I write for Forbes. My articles come on Forbes on how to use which type of VPNs and a lot of stuff on VPNs I write on Forbes. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so yeah, talking about submarine cables, this is a picture of how submarine cables are laid down all across the world. A snapshot of that. So all the color lines which you see, okay, so it's how the cables or the infrastructure which we see. Many believe that the internet is wireless, but it's semi-wireless. It's wireless only till this station. After that, it goes through the cables. Okay, so this is how it looks like, the outline of it. Two places connected to each other via a cable in the middle. Okay, yeah. So who talks about the ownership of this? Who owns these cables? Anyone? Yeah, there are consortiums and groups, organizations which own that. So it's both public, government, and also private companies which owns them. Okay, so I'll skip this in the list of time. Yeah. So coming to the internet, there is a biggest threat to internet with the submarine cables. Any destruction or disruption to this cables means a blackout to the internet of that country. A war on that country means just disrupt the cables, it's gone. You can put a small, any kind of destruction you want. Okay. So damages can be of various types in that. The first one is intentional damage. Okay, which is caused. Okay, so there are some many incidents which are reported on that. One in Russia, Taiwan recently had incidents. There were some ships which has collided to that, and because of which the cables broke, and there is some disruption with the internet over there. And other is the unintentional damage, which happens generally because of the natural calamities, say a cloud or ocean or something like that, some natural calamity, a volcano eruption or anything like that. Okay, which disrupts the cable. So many happens because of earthquakes and such. Okay, the percentage, if I talk about 14% of the cable breaks happen because of the natural calamities, which we cannot control, right? And that causes disruption of internet in those areas. So whenever there is some disaster which happens, we generally see there is a lack of internet. Internet is not working. One of the reasons can be that the cable is broken, and fixing a cable is a real challenge. We'll talk about that too. Yeah. So this is of Tonga. So there a volcanic eruption took place nearby. The cable has broken, and because of that, they lost internet. Yeah. So coming to challenges in protecting these cables. Anyone would like to say some points on that? I have very less time. It's just 5 minutes. Yeah. One, finding out where the cable is broke. That's a big challenge because all this is under the sea, in the ocean. Finding out where the cable is broke is a big challenge first. Second, the repairing vessel has to go to that place. It's kilometers down in the water. So pressure and a lot of factors are there which they have to fix, see, find out, and then fix. Sometimes there's animal waste, which is around the cable. So it's very hard to sometimes detect where exactly the damage has happened. Okay. So some of them, uh, this is answer to who all owns the cables. It's private consortiums, foreign government, and various other companies. Yeah. Some other issues when it comes to fixing the cables are these: who owns it? So there are multiple jurisdiction, and there is something called law of sea, a law of ocean, if anyone is aware of that. So oceans doesn't have any government's control over that. It's totally open. So in that cases, who's gonna fix it? Who, which laws to be applied on that? There's a lot of vague area in that. Okay, and various regulations are there and conflicts of that. Now, what are the risks of these offshore activities? One, there is lack of awareness about the cables. Someone who is laying down new cable or any activity is happening, that organization or that person is not aware of the pre-laid or already laid cables. So whatever activity he is planning, because of that, the cables get damaged. So that's one very big issue. So let's skip this. Yeah. So what APAC is lacking is time. Okay. Just 1 minute more. Just come to this. Yeah. This is a map of how much we have. Yeah. So what action APAC can have in order to protect these cables? One is having an organization or a consortium or a group, a non-profit organization or something like that, which manages like in, but in as when compared to in US, you have an entity which regulates or gives permission or something like that. But in APAC, we don't have anything major on that. So there's an Australian model which we can use. It's a central authority uh, established over there, which is ask before you dig. You know, you dig in the ocean, it says ask before you dig. So like that kind of plans we can have. So with that, if you want my slides, you can just scan the QR code. Anyways, it's on the website also. And any questions? Yeah, please.
What percentage of cables are actually? Hi, Walt, Hurricane Electric. What percentage of cables are actually buried in the sea floor?
Sea flow. Maybe I'm not sure. I have to check on that. You can answer.
So in general, they'll be buried for the first few kilometers until you get out into deep water, at which point they're just laid on the ocean floor.
Percentage.
Yeah. All cables will be buried for the first few kilometers. And when it gets out to deep ocean, I would say the percentage of cables that are buried is 0.
I hope you got that. Any more? Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Walt Walney from Hurricane Electric. I was asked to host this panel, and I would like to ask the panel members to come up here and introduce themselves one at a time, please. They've got one down. So it's too much. So right now.
Okay, I'll start. My name is Mark Tinker. I'm MD at Transmission Corp.
Hi, name is Ganesh. I look after Time Wholesale.
Hi all, I'm Rupesh. I am director at Cyber Jagrati Foundation.
Hello, my name is Marvin. I'm a senior research analyst from Telegeography. Yep.
Jonathan Brewer, a consultant with a website called connectedpacific.org, which is about submarine cables in the Pacific Islands.
So I would like to know what are the planning stages of a submarine cable? Yes, we'll just keep going in order.
Yeah.
That way there's no confusion. Thank you,
Um,
Mr. Mark.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's as you can see, but it's I think the first step is obviously the concept. The specific problem you're trying to solve in a specific geographic area. So you go from concept to planning, surveys, construction, and obviously operation and maintenance, and then decommissioning. At that point, there's obviously a whole process, going through before you get a project up and running. But the first stage is the concept, and obviously how you're going to fund it. And funding is a big portion of how cables either get built or don't get built.
Okay, so the average lifespan from the start of a concept to an RFS of a cable, some can go between 4 to 5 years. Right, it's that long to actually build a submarine cable. But generally, like Mark said, yes, the starting is always the planning, which is the most important. You have to know which zones to pass, which are which areas have got less prone to cable cuts and those sort of things. Then you also have to see who your consortium members are, because the branching unit that goes into those countries also need to be assessed and looked at especially, right?
Maintenance. Yeah. So once the cables are all laid, laying cables is one job, maintaining is another job. So as I discussed earlier, so any breakdowns or anything, so fixing it is a really challenge.
Yeah, I think Mark and Ganesh mentioned quite a bit on maybe I just like to add on that the life cycle of laying a cables also, you have to, like what Ganesh mentioned, you have to consider your consortium members as well. Who would you like to have in the investing in this cable? And on top of that, you also have to consider the different paths. There is a lot of ways you can lay a cable. Let's say, for example, intra-Asia, you can go via the traditional route, you can go via new route. So I think there's a lot to consider on that part as well.
For the route consideration, you have some considerations as to where you're going to land the cable, because often you're going to disturb a fragile environment around the beach. Sometimes you have to cut through coral so that you can get the cable burying apparatus for the first few kilometers. On land, there's some considerations where you might put the beach manhole. When you're running the cable in the shallow waters just off of land, you need to, at least in the United States, negotiate with the fishing associations so that you're not bringing a cable into an area where they regularly trawl or fish, because of course that would result in cable breakages. Once a cable is in place, especially in sensitive areas, like in New Zealand, where we have cables connecting our two main islands, we have the concept of a cable protection zone where we have active boats 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, monitoring the area where the cable is buried to make sure that there is no trawling, so fishing where they drag a net on the bottom of the seafloor, and there's no anchoring, and there's no stopping in the cable protection zones.
So I assume when people are trawling, how deep are the cables buried, and shouldn't they take the depth of the burying of the cable deeper than the trolling damage?
In general, the cable is going to be sitting directly on the seafloor in areas where people are doing fishing and trawling. It is only the first few kilometers from land where the cable is buried. Thus far, in the history of submarine cables, it has been impractical to bury a submarine cable in deep water. There are now new remote operated vehicles that will bury a cable in deep water, but this is not a common practice yet.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that part of the Marine Survey is actually looking for unexploded ordnance from wars gone by. So that's a practical, interesting point about that.
On the planning side, actually, I feel very lucky I can ask all these questions because this is something I really don't know a lot about. On the planning side, what governments are easier to work with by gaining to gain access to a landing station?
So every country has its own peculiarities. And as you know, there's a lot of things happening between the US and China. So there's a lot of restrictions also in certain parts of the world. But generally, you have to work with the maritime authorities as you come into the shore, because they are the only ones that can guide you where the areas for cable carts are prone. Now, in the deep sea, like the Atlantic, it's basically international waters. So there is no maritime that's really covering that. But you still have to do your homework to see whether those areas are prone to tsunami or prone to earthquakes, those sort of things. Yeah, because natural disasters will still hit those areas. But you also, on top of that, you also have to plan your routes properly, because sometimes you may want to pass a certain zone, and that will lead to a longer cable length. And if that's the case, it could result in two things. One could be cost. The longer the cable is, the more costly it is. And it also impacts the latency of the cables.
Yeah, I just want to add to Ganesh's point in terms of your route planning, because I mean, as for new cables, at least just now I mentioned for intra-Asia, most of the cables like your ADC and SJC2 stuff like this, they are transversing via the traditional, I'll say, route via the South China Sea. But nowadays we are witnessing more new cables that are exploring new routes via the east of the Philippines, which then again brings on to the point where you have to consider your careful routing, because you're actually like cutting it very close to the coast of, let's say, Malaysia or the Philippines, which means that you need to protect the cable more. You have to bury the cable more, and as well as you are cutting through a lot of like oil pipelines, oil rigs, and maritime activities, stuff like this. So I think in general, is there are a lot. Okay, so what I'm trying to say, sorry, I think the mic, yeah. Hello. Yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is like there are actually a lot of moving parts in actually trying to lay a cable. It's not like, oh, you want to try to explore a new route and you can just go ahead and do it, because obviously to try to avoid South China Sea, for instance, is a challenge. But going via a new direction, it sounds good on paper, but actually they have their own sets of challenges as well. For instance, if you want to trespass Indonesian waters, like to the Philippines and up north to Japan, they also have their own challenges as well. It's not like, oh, okay, it's just a new diverse route. You can just go ahead and just lay your cable, because, yeah.
So, well, did you ask which countries were easier to land a cable in?
Yes.
Yeah, so
We should share one mic the whole time.
Yeah, this one doesn't work either. It's just one mic. These one's very noisy.
It's okay, we were good with one.
all right, so the very interesting thing about ease of landing cables, New Zealand would be a country where it's easy to land a cable because you have the environmental considerations, and that's it. There's no considerations of competition. There's no considerations of national security. If you can meet the bar for environmental conditions, you can land the cable. But any cable that lands in any territory of the United States, which includes Guam, which is a large hub for cables in East Asia and the North Pacific, any cable that lands in any part of America needs to pass a group of federal agencies in the United States called Team Telecom. And Team Telecom considers competition and national security and physical security and all sorts of other considerations, including who's going to own the cable, what other territories the cable is going to pass through, where it's going to land, who's going to use it. And this approval can take anywhere from 2 years to infinity. Sometimes a ruling will never be made on a cable and the project will just not continue. So there's your answer. It definitely varies as to where the cable is landing, how easy it is.
If everyone would turn off the cell phones, that'd be great. Also, after every question, if someone has a question from the audience, let me know and I'll run the mic to you. So we've gone through the planning phase of looking at a new cable. Let's talk about design.
Thank you. Previous cables were basically anywhere from 2 to 8 fiber pairs. In recent, I would say, since 2015, cables have now gone into a phase that's known as SDM, spatial division multiplexing. And the problem we're trying to solve there is one of capacity. So we're increasing the number of fiber pairs in the cables, and average fiber pair count now is 12 all the way up to 24. Potentially up to 32 at some point. And in some cases, we're actually looking at multi-core fiber. So, having fiber that has 2 cores in it, so you can double the core capacity of the fiber itself. And other interesting mechanisms like multi-mode in the multi-core fiber and things like that. But yeah, every new cable now, especially one that's funded or sponsored by a content provider, does have an element of an SDM design. Because the commercial lifespan of cables now is anywhere from 7 to 10 years, even if it's easily 240, 250 terabits of capacity. So we want to get as many fiber pairs in, because once the wet plant is buried, that's it. You can't yank it out to upgrade it.
Okay, yeah. So enhancements in optical technology has actually evolved. And like Mark said, now we can do more fiber pairs, which also results in also sometimes lower latency and power efficiency. On top of the design, I think what has changed also over the years is in the past, it was on a cost sharing model. So everybody who's a consortium member who participates shares the cost of every branch. But today it's evolving. You just look after your branch and you take the main trunk. So that also has an impact on the design of certain cables. And of course, because sometimes depends on who the partners are in the consortium, there's less branches. Now, as you know, the cost to lay a fiber, it's actually more expensive if you come in towards a branch, because that's when you have to actually do the digging near the shores and everything. So the cost is actually heavier near the shores. So the less number of branches you have, you can manage the cost a little bit better.
Next question.
Dave from APNIC, but here by myself. This is probably more for John. Pacific Islands, we see a lot of branching units being offered up for a lot of the islands. What percentage are being taken up by them to actually connect? And is there actually even the impetus for them to do it if they've already got one existing cable that's servicing them? So why are we doing it?
Historically, there have been cables built with branching units that haven't been taken up. For example, PPC-1 from Australia to Guam. I have a feeling that Hawaii has a branching unit unused facing New Caledonia, probably Fiji also. So why would a Pacific Island take up another submarine cable if they already have one? Well, resilience is very important, but where is the money going to come from to pay for the resilience? These cable projects in the Pacific Islands, none of them have met the revenues that they were planned on. The financial models made by the development agencies like Asian Development Bank and World Bank priced these cables as if people were moving from satellite to submarine cable, and they would just pay just a little bit less for the submarine cable because, you know, it's better than satellite. But they didn't consider the fact that satellite data pricing would drop precipitously. And we have a case in the Cook Islands where they got a new cable and the provider there continued to use their satellite services for 2 years after the cable landed, preferring their satellite services because it was much cheaper. Yeah, so why we have the branching units? Of course, the branching units are put in there because some development funding provided for the branching units. But why are they not being taken up? They're not being taken up because it's economically not viable.
So I'm really grateful because I can ask all my selfish questions. As part of planning and designing, I guess I'm going to ask a dual pointed question is that what impact does AI and the massive computing power have any impact on submarine cable? And the design part is that if you have satellites and Elon Musk going launching tons and tons of these Starlink units, is that going to have any impact on your future growth of these cables?
So the AI bit is, I think, as much as everyone else as me, is we don't know what actually is going to mean. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. Practically, in a technical sense, on subsea systems, it doesn't mean anything. It's just extra capacity that we think is going to come, and that's driving construction of data centers and everything around that, including subsea. But in a practical sense, it doesn't change. Subsea construction is still very old school, and the people that build subsea systems are still very old school. They talk about AI, but it doesn't really mean much in a practical sense. So we'll leave that to the product and marketing teams. For as it pertains to Starlink, Starlink is, I think, projecting to build about 24 terabits worth of capacity. That's only about 1% of what the internet is using. So 99% is still coming from subsea. Subsea is not under any risk of being challenged by Starlink or any other satellite service for the foreseeable future. It just doesn't scale as well. It's great for backup, but it's not primary infrastructure in that sense. Yeah.
Okay.
So when you're using subsea capacity, how much is data is actually data center to data center traffic versus actual user traffic?
Well, now it's growing because most of the cable builds are being done by the content and cloud providers, and much of that is to interconnect their own data center facilities, with a small portion going back to ISPs and telco. So I'd say for now, probably 50-50, 60-40, let's say. I think a little bit more as older cables die out and the newer cables pick up more of the slack. But yeah, I'd probably put it in half and half, let's say.
So AI, you can't go to a conference these days without using the buzzword. Okay, but at the end of the day, what is AI? I mean, it's like Mark said, it's just bandwidth consumption, all right? So the more the processing the more bandwidth you use. So AI just translates in greater demand for bandwidth. I think the only point I want to make on the AI stuff is that with AI, you need data centers, you're right. But data centers takes 2 years to build, right? And whereas submarine may take 4 to 5 years. So there is a time gap between the two. That's my only point on AI. Other than that, it's just bandwidth. It's just more bandwidth, right? Now, whether there's a correlation between the data center power consumption versus the capacity, I don't, as of my knowledge, I don't know whether there is any specific correlation, because at the end of the day, it depends on the users. Some just use it for processing. Some use it for data transfer. So there's no direct correlation. If it is, also the statistics would be varied. on the satellite question, based on today, I don't see how satellite can replace submarines because of the latency. I think satellite's latency is not as strong as submarine. Besides that, I don't know whether the satellite can do something like 100 gigs or 1 tera, whereas the submarine and terrestrial networks actually can. But I see satellite today as an alternative, that it works parallel with the submarine. Because to go to very remote areas, it's impossible to build submarine or terrestrial network. It's more practical to actually use satellite. Okay, and in these remote areas, the likelihood of them using high bandwidth, high capacity is very slim. So it can be served by the satellite operators. Yep. So I do not know when it will evolve. I know there's talks about building metro network in the sky and everything, but that I think submarine has still got easily another 20 plus years to go.
Yeah, I agree with Mark and Ganesh. I don't think like a satellite is gonna replace submarine cable, at least not anytime soon. Yeah. And then for the other one regarding the Gen AI and stuff, yeah, because I mean just to build context, I think there's the different components to AI. You have your training clusters and your inference clusters, and then in terms of your your training clusters, like where are you gonna host your training servers? Is it in the US and stuff? And then in the process, you also need to get your training data. Is your training data gonna come from US, or is it or is it gonna come from all around the globe? So in that process, it may or may not create some long haul demand, but from what from at least from our point of view is that we project that there are going to be increase in long haul demand for the time being, but to pinpoint exactly how much is this increase, I think it's almost impossible, and it's very hard to quantify exactly, bandwidth gonna increase 25%, 50%. I think just it's not currently being backed by any research firms and stuff. And on our end, we also speak to the hyperscalers like Meta and Google. And honestly, the short answer to the question is they themselves also don't know, like, how much bandwidth they require in the long run. I mean, I'm not even talking about 5 years, even 2 to 3 years. They even have some level of difficulty trying to forecast their demand. So all I'm trying to say is it's really quite a black box. I mean, sorry, not black box. It's kind of unknown right now. But for sure, I mean, at least we see that there are going to be some increase in demand in long haul, and then which is why it translates to more need for subsea cable investing. Yeah.
Thank you. AI can be a consumer of submarine cable capacity. It also can help in the design. And I've read a paper recently. Mark is completely correct. Submarine cable design and route planning right now is super old school. Like, people use maritime charts. People take boats out and they do side scans sonar, or they do LiDAR, and they kind of make a decision. Okay, we think this is going to be a good route for the cable. And in a lot of cases, they've done this because, well, this is where everybody else has put their cables, and obviously these cables are okay. With AI now and the amount of data that we have on the seafloor, it probably will be used, if it hasn't already, for route planning, especially in complex areas like the shallow waters of Indonesia, where we are running cables now so that we can avoid the South China Sea, so that we can make sure that when there is a cable break, the cable repair vessels can get there unimpeded and not be have any territory sovereignty issues on their way. So that was number one. Number two, will Starlink replace, or could Starlink or other satellites replace submarine cables? This is an issue of population density. Now, a new submarine cable was just, a branch unit was just built to Tuvalu at great expense. Many, many, many millions of dollars was spent delivering this cable to Tuvalu. They have a population of fewer than 10,000 people. You can today get 100 gigabits per second from the ground to space, the ground again, via satellite. There are, NASA has done things with free space optics to space at 4.6 terabits per second. I know. Yeah. It is completely reasonable for a population of 10,000 that is out in the middle of the Pacific Islands to never have a submarine cable. You look at how many islands in Indonesia are occupied, it's like thousands. Same with the Philippines, thousands. You do not need to bring a submarine cable to every one of those islands. Certainly in the Pacific, where countries like Kiribati are spread out over thousands of kilometers, Federated States of Micronesia, again, spread out over thousands of kilometers. It is not reasonable to bring submarine cable connectivity to all of these places. Many of them have populations of fewer than 200. Satellite is going to be the solution forever for these places. So how's that?
Audience?
Hello, I'm Ciprian from Interland in Romania. I would like to ask about an environmental side of the problem. I want to ask if in the planning phase, besides the commercial plan and also technical, what is the lifetime for this cable, the planned lifetime, and what happens if there is a plan from the beginning, what happens with this cable after? And also a second question, please. How many cables do you think it's enough? Because I've seen similar routes with multiple cables. From my personal point of view, I've seen the website. I take a look often at it, and I think it's many cables. What is the reason to have so many cables? Besides maybe competition, is there not enough capacity? I mean, for cables going from on the same route. Thank you.
Also to add on, what is the lifespan of a typical cable that's laid today?
Yeah, so the technical lifespan, once the cable is laid, is on average 25 years. You can exceed that, give or take a year or three. But that's mainly down to the electronics, the amplification, and so forth that decay over time, so 25 years. But the commercial lifespan is a bit shorter than that. I think I'll let Ganesh talk about that one specifically. After the cables are decommissioned, they can either stay at the seabed or they can be removed. We haven't had a lot of experience yet in cable removal. So that's something that's still being explored for various reasons. And your other question was about the environmental impact? Yeah, so I think when most people are, well, now there's sustainability angles for cable construction, but historically it hasn't been a consideration about what to do once the cable's been decommissioned. I don't know, maybe John or Ganesh might know a little bit more about what's trending now, but historically it wasn't a consideration.
Okay, let me address the first one first. So yes, the technical lifetime of a cable can go up to 25 years. However, the commercial lifespan may be much shorter than that. Some could be 10, some could be 15 years. Reason being because of the huge bandwidth requirements, they've already maxed up the capacity. And what we see today trending also, it's only the popular routes that is maxed up. You know, a cable system may have other routes. So it's only the popular routes that is maxed up, and there will be some branching units or certain other routes may be empty or as good as very low utilization. But because of technology enhancement, sometimes you can you can modify the system at the SLTE to actually increase the capacity so that the commercial lifespan may equate the technology lifespan of the cable system. What happens when a cable is up? Well, I don't think I'm that old to see one case, but from what the little bit that I know, when it's decommissioned, they just leave it in the seabed. However, the shore may be different. As you come towards the shore, I'm not sure. Maybe John can answer that later. But at least the deep sea, they just leave it there. Okay. But your interesting question, which you also raised, which is there are so many supply in the market today. That is actually a very interesting question because I also asked the same question. I mean, everybody's building the submarine. I know everybody is talking about AI and everything, and the bandwidth will be increasing. No doubt the bandwidth is increasing, but the supply also is increasing. Now, all this goes back to demand and supply, and it will impact the prices. When there's oversupply, then what happens to the prices? You know, if prices just come down, then would you get your ROI? So I do not know. There's just so many been built, and I also sometimes question, will the ROI come in? However, some are building because of restrictions that they have. They can't go through a particular zone, so they have to bypass. So the new cables are coming up to avoid certain zones, right? That could be it. Some could also be equipment vendors and so on. We cannot use certain vendors, so we have to come up with another cable system to actually build to avoid certain vendors. So I guess it boils down to the consortium owners. I trust they would have done their homework. They would have done their business case analysis to see whether, it's justified, right? Now, in the past, also those days, it was basically telecom operators, the telecom carriers that used to invest. Today, the tech giants are doing it themselves, right? So there's also a big shift, And when the telecom operators did it last time, it's mainly for their organic traffic, and they will resell the rest. But if the tech giants are building it themselves, and what happens to these cables? So there's a lot of questions on demand and supply, but I trust that the consortium members or the private cable system would have done their necessary homework to assess that.
Yeah, I agree with Ganesh on many points. I would like to add on environmental thing. So removing cable also includes cost. So many don't prefer to do that. And if you talk about what pollution or something it might create, it's same like some rubber, some metal in the ocean. So it's like that. If you talk about the pollution, but it's way down the bed. So less on the aquatic life it has, I feel.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add one point to Ganesh, what Ganesh said before we carry on the panel was it also depends on the phase of the network build out, because like I think it was mentioned earlier that the submarine cables, it takes a long time to finally come to service. Like for instance, like ADC, so it just came to service last quarter, but I think since the start of like inception and planning and all the marine studies, it was like 2018 or 2018, so it's been like 7 years before the cable actually come to service. So I think with regards to demand and supply, what we see for the wavelength pricing, it's on certain routes where it's like the supply is low for the time being because the cables take a long time to come online. You realize that the prices are staying still, So like for instance, if you see, let's say, popular routes like Marseille to Singapore, this the prices has been hovering about 24 to 25,000. I'm talking about 100G wavelength. So it's hovering about 24 to 25,000 for the longest time, like about 2 to 3 years now. Yeah, so I think, back to the point, it's just basically supply and demand. So when the new phase of cables come online, you're like your CME V6, your Africa One, IEX, stuff like this will come online. We obviously project that the prices will, erode again.
Thank you. I can circle back to what happens when submarine cables are decommissioned. In some cases, they are used for scientific research. Cables have been instrumented with pressure sensors, salinity sensors. They're used to measure what's going on geophysically in the oceans and from a climate change temperature and salinity perspective. So I've read a few papers on this. I just looked one up again. I think one of the cables that was used this way was a Tyco Trans-Pacific cable that would have been built around 2001, and segments of that decommissioned around 2014. Anyway, there are uses of that, and then sometimes they just sit there in the water. And some cables have vastly exceeded their 25-year lifespan. For example, the Ash cable, which is still active from American Samoa to Hawaii, was part of PAC-RIM, I think, still with electrical amplifiers and not optical amplifiers in line. And they're still running 2 times 560 megabits per second on that cable, which is probably 30 some years old now.
Joe from Rehans. You mentioned about the odds of putting out a cable out to, say, a Pacific island is sort of related to its population density. I have heard the odds of sending a cable down to Antarctica. What's sort of the feasibility there, even if you would add research sensors to maybe try and get more value out of that cable?
Yeah, I mean, cables to Antarctica, right? You're saying. So actually, we heard of some projects like this. Usually those projects are funded by the government, and I mean, obviously there's no commercial use to that for that cable. But we do heard about this. But I mean, for myself, I'm not really buying into those type of cables until it actually is like concrete, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, so projects like those are, they're not practical. I mean, I don't even think we have the ships yet that are designed to, burrow through the snow at that depth I mean, you have to have a ship in front of the cable laying ship and then potentially something else behind it's not practical. You're talking about maybe easily a 10, 15, $20 billion build. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's great for TV though.
Why would anyone ever build a fiber down into Antarctica? Well, Starlink, right?
Dealt with it. Hi, Herbie Allen from the NSRC, and we were involved with NSF's attempt to get better connectivity to the Antarctica Research Station. The number one reason why fiber isn't considered is the movement of the ice if you try to get the cable near the station, because it's a long ways in, and you just can't do it. Plus, the ice grows up over time significantly, so your cable gets buried under ice. So the next step is, what do? Well, you get Elon convinced that it's worthwhile to have a satellite go that way, even though there's no audience. And then very nicely, they did donate actually what was necessary, and this has happened, and they've now improved their connectivity dramatically down at that station using satellites at this point in time.
Thank you. Pankaj from ISP Association of India. I just heard about decommissioning of the cables. So the question which I come to my mind, is there a regulation in some countries that if the cables have outlived their life, you have to remove it, or it is just left to the consortium or to the, whoever relate? Because again, I understand it's a cost to take the cable out, and the consortium, when they fund in, that is for the cable laying, not for bringing it out. So just wondering how it works. Thank you.
Yeah, so I know, for example, I was at a OECD panel in Paris in November, and this came up. So sustainability, another buzzword, about what we do with cables and how we federalize cable construction and access and zone agreements, etc. No real solution, no real practical statement, just sustainability, let's say. And also the submarine networks in Singapore last year, it also came up as well. This is September. Like John has said, I think at shore, there might be some incentive to take the cables out. I'm not aware of any specific regulation that requires you to do that at the end of the life of the cable. So I think it would be a proactive move by the cable owner to do for whatever reason. Out in deep waters, no incentive whatsoever at all. So it's like solar panels. We don't yet know what's going to happen once they run out. Like, once you get the 30 years out of them, then what? Or like lithium batteries, right? We don't know what's going to happen when it's time to decommission them, because we're now starting to get into the first 10, 15 years of operating those things. Subsea, we really haven't had to look at this now. So we'll see.
So a logic question as a newbie in this area, it seems like if you remove a cable, it actually causes more damage to the marine life. Doing the best.
You could kill some fish, I suppose, as you pick it up. Or I don't know, the copper. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist in this area, but yeah, I think removal of the cable could potentially be maybe as costly as laying it, because then you have to have the ship do the route, wind it up. No, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
No, it's fine. Okay. Regarding the removal of it, if it is considered in the definition of e-waste, maybe some laws can be applicable on that. In India, we have an e-waste policy, so which is recently made. So if they consider it as an e-waste, then definitely the laws will be applicable on that. Yes.
Check.
There was a case, maybe John, maybe you can remember which case this was. There was a case where there was a donor cable. So a cable was pulled up out of, this is South Pacific, from one route, and basically the capacity was no longer usable for the route, but it was sufficient to lay for another South Pacific island. I'm blanking on which island this was, but there was a case where a cable was pulled up out of the ocean. They had to strip the barnacles off, but as far as like costs go, like the majority of the cost is the fabrication of the cable itself. Installation is also, like laying the cable is also costly, but the cable itself is in this case, I'm forgetting the people who were involved in this project, but there was a case where you pull the cable up. But I mean, I don't know if it's been repeated, but there certainly was one.
So twice that I know
Twice,
of.
there you go.
In this case, you're talking about Pac Rim East, which got turned into Ash Cable, American Samoa, Hawaii.
Yes.
And the other case I know of is Goki, the Guam, Okinawa, Kyushu, and Incheon cable, which never actually made it to Incheon. And I'm pretty sure that some part of the Taiko Trans-Pacific, the north route of that, ended up getting pulled up and used for this Goki cable, which is operated by AT&T, as far as I know, in service with no commercial customers. No commercial customers.
Sure. Thanks.
Anyone else?
So the panelist, if you can share some best practices for the fault repair time, which is taking longer time in India actually nowadays because of, the delay from the Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Defense to get the approval for the crews as well as for the ships. So any best practices, if you can share, that will be helpful.
Yeah, so one of the things that we discussed at this Paris thing for the OECD was to create, what's the word we used specifically? Forget the word, it's not a buzzword, but it was to find a way to, I think it was harmonize, yes, it was harmonize. We'll harmonize regulatory, steps, I think in the OECD countries, but I think generally across the board. And I mean, you and I know that trying to get regulators together to agree on one thing is one thing. And then there's a whole other thing that's life. I think that's the only way to have, blocks of regions, South Asia, North Asia, Africa, Europe, etc., to agree to sort of make regulation less onerous. Now, that's, as easy as having cross-border fiber going between two countries that don't talk to each other. It's unlikely to happen in a practical sense, but that's where I think we'd need to go. And I know the folks in Europe are trying to do that. The folks in Brazil or South America are trying to do that too. Africa, there's no chance. We've tried to do that. It's not going to work. I don't know so much about Asia Pac. But I think that's the only way to improve those things. Otherwise, yeah, you're still stuck in the same cycle. You know, you have to obviously book the ship, mobilize it. That's a whole, you know, maybe 2-3 weeks before it comes out. Approvals, permitting, etc., visas, all of that stuff. You're looking at anywhere from, you know, 3 to 6, 8 weeks to get a cable repaired, assuming the ship is available, assuming the finance people have the budget to spend the money to give you that to get it done. So yeah, it's one of those things that's old school about cable systems that I think is going to be like that for the foreseeable future. We haven't built cables or repaired cables any differently now than we did in, say, 1858. It's pretty much the same.
3 to 6 weeks, I think that's very fast. Okay. We've seen longer, much longer than that. And you see, sometimes I think one big issue is it's the availability of the ships. But the other one that's also taking time is obtaining the permits as you come. So it depends where the cut is. If the cut is in the ocean, where there's no man's land, it's a lot easier. Then it's just a matter of getting the ships already. But if the cut is near the shore, then you got to look at which country, you know, and then is it easy to get the permits? Then also there's a squabble between the consortium members in the sense that, oh, that is Malaysia. I don't need to go there. You know, what's the urgency? I mean, it could be cases like that. So 3 to 6 weeks, I mean, it's amazing if I can find one that repairs that's fast. Yeah.
Maybe I mentioned about an Australian model in my slides. So you can use that. It's a central authority. You can have a central authority which takes care of this. And second option would be mutual agreements between countries for this purpose. So like we have MLATs for the purpose of this, we can have some agreements with the countries to support in cases of such. And maybe some arbitration is also possible. So maritime arbitration is something which is growing. So in that also you can see.
So I'd like to go out of order here. Can we talk about feasibility study, please?
Yeah, so that would essentially be the business case as well as looking at other macroeconomic factors. So GDP, university education, mobile penetration, fiber penetration, average age of consumers, this sort of thing. Really on the economic and business side, just to see if that would work, looking at potential pre-sale activity, you know, who can buy fiber pair to pay for at least 30, 40, 50% of the project cost, etc., that sort of thing. Feasibilities would normally be both desktop and practical survey. So you would have to acquire funding to do the desktop study first, because you're going to take up people's time. And then once that gets approved, then you're going to get some feasibility funding to actually go out and do surveys, check for any legal requirements, regulatory, landing permits, that sort of thing, environmental impact assessments, see what that's not the actual impact assessments, it's just to see what it would take to get that done. So you're normally looking at about somewhere from, let's say, 1 to 5% of the project cost in feasibility. And that would cover, you know, technical project work, legal, regulatory, construction, pre-sales, etc. It forms part of the larger business case. And then at that point, the project funders can decide whether they want to go ahead with the project or not. So you're going to be in for a couple of $1 million anyway, whether you go ahead with the project or not.
So feasibility goes back to the business case. Now, as you know, the lifespan of the cables is about 25 years, right? 15 years ago, how much was a 10 gig? Okay. So at that time, 15 years ago, a 10 gig may cost X. Today, that X is 100 gig. So just think about that. So when you do your feasibility study, take note that price erosion will happen. Are you going to get the ROI, right? That's one thing. Then you also have to look at consortium members, who's in it, what's their equity share in the market. I mean, in the especially in the trunk, because if someone has more market share, of course they've got economics of scale, and of course they can be more competitive on the pricing, and that's also a factor on feasibility study that you have to look. The other thing is the cable system also you have to look. Is it a CLS to CLS cable system, or is it a POP to POP cable system? Because there's cost difference, there's advantages and disadvantages of both situations. So feasibility really, there's a lot of factors you have to look into. And you have to also look into the SLTE equipments that you're using. Can it be upgraded? What happens if the commercial lifespan is short? Can you get more out of it? Can you squeeze the assets more? So a lot of things have to be factored in.
Pretty much covered. So next time we have to start from there.
Yeah, and just to add on Ganesh's point was when it comes to, I mean, I'm speaking from the commercial side of things, which is like, as what Ganesh, like price will always erode in the long run. And again, I don't feel like, I hope not like repeating myself, but because of the fact that the cable laying process, the project is so long, so you actually have to forecast, like not now, but you're supposed to forecast prices 7 years, 5 years down the road, which I think that is one of the problem about cable subsea investing, because there's a lot of, how to say, uncertainty in trying to calculate your returns for the project. Yeah.
Just want to mention that the majority of, and Mark, back me up or shoot me down, majority of new capacity now is not being built by consortiums, but being built by the cloud providers. So the feasibility studies and the economic models for these cables now are completely different from what they were 10 years ago. People aren't worrying about what they can sell 100 gig wavelength on a cable or a 400 gig wavelength on the cable. They're worried about what their OpEx is going to be, what the rest of their business needs to be, what they need for their business, and how much money. They don't care about the cost per wave anymore. They care about how much capacity they need.
Maybe it's one of the reasons someone asked why multiple cables. So some are old cables. Maybe the feasibility is also a reason they need more cables.
So John does mention a very interesting development that's happening right now in the space, because a lot of the investment is coming in from the content folk. Traditionally, you would have built the cable for them, right? They would have been the biggest uptakers of that capacity. Now it's the other way around. They build it for themselves and they invite you to play for some portion. But because they're also tying up a lot of construction vessel time and a lot of fiber manufacturing time, there's not enough bandwidth, no pun intended, for the rest of the telecoms industry to actually get cables built in time. So what then happens is, and we're seeing this in Africa, for example, is that the older cables, and I say old, I don't mean like 25 years ago, I mean literally 10 years ago cables are now end of life, commercially at least. There's no more room for expansion, even with new technology. So what that then means is that there's a shift to where prices start to go up. And not just with old cables, but also with new ones as well, because that new cable is the only scalable cable on that side of the geography. There's nothing else to compete with it. So it's a new cable, it's much higher capacity, much lower cost per bit, but there's no competition. So there's no incentive for the price to come down until some other cable comes online, which on average now is anywhere from 5 to 7 years, maybe 8. So I suspect that as more and more of the projects go to the cloud and content folk as opposed to the telcos, there's a potential that prices might stabilize and then maybe even rise, at least in some markets. It would be interesting to see how telegeography model that phenomenon.
Yeah, I think, like I said, studied earlier, it really depends on the principles of supply and demand. So just off the top of my head, like popular routes like Singapore to Tokyo, again Singapore to Marseille, throughout the past 2 years, we have seen prices like keeping still. as compared to, for example, KL to Singapore. No, those prices are still eroding per se. Yeah, and also just to build on John's point was that it's true that hyperscalers, they are investing in bigger and newer cables, but I think it's not all doom and gloom in that sense that I think their specialty per se, they like to invest in all the major highways, so your transatlantic and your Pacific kind of cables, like your Google, your Meta, all these sort of cables. I think for the traditional carriers, yeah, we can still invest in like maybe perhaps the smaller corridors like Vietnam, Singapore. There's this cable, and then like for instance from Singapore to Jakarta, your Insika cables, Nongsa Changi. This sort of cable. So I mean it's true that there's gonna be a shift, but I think there are spaces where the traditional players can maneuver into. That's all I can see. But then again, I think we really sort of have to play along with sort of the big guys right now, because they are investing a lot of cables, and a lot of them.
Yeah, so I think in general, the telecoms industry is struggling because customers don't want to pay for bandwidth, they want to pay for data, right? They just want it for free, and they want to watch the Netflix all the time, and that's fine. But they want it to be fast. So equipment vendors, Ericsson, Huawei, whoever are going to charge what they're going to charge. The price won't come down; it might even go up. So telcos are suffering. Because customers don't want to pay for anything. So margins are really, really thin. Doesn't matter where you are. Broadband, GSM, transit, it's all the same. But the price of equipment is still what it is. The price of deploying and maintaining is still what it is. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure as ISPs and service providers cannot export a lot of that cost and turn it into revenue from the content providers who pay a lot of cash for those projects. RUs is what they mostly bought, and that could save a company from time to time. But that revenue isn't coming anymore, or it's going to reduce a fair bit because they're building their own networks. So ultimately, I think where the telcos are going to end up, I think is a bit tricky, let's say, and there's either some consolidation or downsizing that I expect to happen. That means that the kind of cable projects that telcos do is, as you described, won't be large projects. There'll be smaller projects that don't yield a good return, and that could potentially mean that the performance or user experience will go down until maybe Google and Microsoft decide to step in. So it's all very hazy at the moment, but not looking good for telco, if I'm honest.
Thank you so much. Tim from Nokia. On the question of ROI and cost, particularly for the consortium-owned cables, for the hyperscaler owned and built ones, they can just smooth the cost over 15, 20, 25 years, and their average cost of wave comes down. But for the consortium cables, on the feasibility and economic feasibility side of things, where do they aim to put the ROI? Because, as you mentioned, there's a few moving parts there in terms of price erosion and market availability. When looking at a feasibility study, do they aim to hit ROI 50% through the lifetime, 80% through the lifetime? Where does that point usually land?
That's a tough question. Okay, telco carriers usually, in the past, they used to sell it to the hyperscalers. But like you said, now the hyperscalers are building it for themselves. So who do the telcos sell it to? Now they can sell it to other carriers, but like I told you, the price erosions. So prices are coming down like crazy. So where does the ROI come from? That is a serious question that most telcos have to assess. Now, Mark is right. The margins are coming down tremendously, and there's pressure to drop prices to the end consumer, right? But the materials to build a submarine cable is actually going up, right? Now I know with the latest technology you can get more bandwidth from each cable, from a fiber pair and so on. But that's where you have to really do the maths and see whether that price erosion with the additional bandwidth can it cover the cost of your portion. I don't think there is a perfect answer for this. I think every company needs to do their own business case. In the past, the bigger telcos may also invest, but not for the purpose of reselling, but to cater to their organic traffic. They want their IP and everything, you know. So they could invest for that purpose. But how far do you go? I mean, what sort of investment there is, right? And also to note some of these, I don't know, for example, I'm just throwing an example. Last time, maybe people from, just say, Vietnam used to invest in submarine to go to Singapore because they want to get connected to all the hyperscalers or for the IP. What happens if Google, Microsoft all then move to Vietnam? Where's the need for that? That's also another question to, yeah. So they have to make this analysis. And I think what we said earlier about the cable system lifespan is 25 years. It takes 5 years to build. You're looking at 30 years. So you've got to really plan for 30 years.
Yeah, so in the old days, you pre-sold 50% of the cable up front to sort of de-risk the project and, you know, deal with that on the equity or debt side. That was the old days. That's still the goal these days also, especially if you are a telco, either telco private or even consortium. You can de-risk it by having more players on the system, but also if you have too many players who are in the same business, then you're just, you know, shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because you'll all just race to the bottom competing with each other. Yeah, right. But now it's the other way around, right? So now they build the system and they invite you to buy fiber pair, let's say. So let's say that you can, you know, show the bankers that you have 50% upfront, fine, pre-sale, that's good. You still have another 50% to go. So that's uncertain. And that's a good number. So I'd say now practically maybe 25, 30% is the most you can pre-sale with any degree of uncertainty. And even then, there's no guarantees. So the business case is very weak now, unless there's a hyperscaler involved, or unless China is involved, because they've got the national fortitude to pay for this sort of thing. And then, of course, you run into what John was saying before with Team Telecom saying you can't land in the US because you're China affiliated. And that's a practical issue. But yeah, as a private telco, unless you're in a very dry market, let's say Middle East to Suez Canal, for example, yeah, it's going to be pretty hard to get a project off the ground.
I'd just like to comment that there are a lot of companies that will invest in telecommunications infrastructure, tower companies that own mobile towers, passive fiber optic networks. There are pension funds that invest in these things. I don't think you'll find any pension funds anywhere in the world investing in submarine cables. They're too risky. These are the domains of private family offices, private equity, people who are going to take a risk, and they're not going to be putting all of their investments in submarine cables. It's going to be, you know, one of many things that they do to balance their portfolio out, because yeah, it's hard to make a buck right now, I think.
Pankaj from ISPI. So a good point from the Indian perspective is that earlier 60 to 70% of the traffic used to be Indian traffic, domestic. With the onset of opening up of major data centers, MTDCs in India, and of course all these hyperscalers building their own, you know, data centers in India. Informally, I can say that the 92% of the traffic is now within India. Only the 8% of the internet traffic is going out, which also probably will include some capacities which the hyperscalers also buy. But the traffic growth is so humongous that India still needs a lot of cable systems, because India is also serving neighboring countries right now, from to Nepal, Bhutan, and to some extent Bangladesh. But yes, the business case, I don't know how. It's go down to the same, that only the hyperscalers can build in their cables, and they can leave some small capacities for the telcos, because they have to ride on the Indian license. Indian license conditions are such that you have to go through the Indian international long distance operators. So I don't know about the other countries, whether hyperscalers can land the cable. And the other is, once the cable lands, so in India, there are gatekeepers, whosoever owns the cable landing stations. They also charge a humongous, gatekeeper fee. They call it access facilitation charge, which is huge. So that's the business case looks like in India. Thank you.
So I'd like to combine funding with pre-sales. It just seems logical those go together. John?
Look, I've only been peripherally involved in one cable with funding and pre-sales, and as our colleague from Australia mentioned, having a hyperscaler commit to capacity on that cable is what brought that particular cable over the line, and brought competition into the submarine cable market from West Coast US to Australia and New Zealand. Without that particular hyperscaler, we would not have that competition. It is very, very, very difficult to get funding. Oh no, I guess I was peripherally involved in a second cable that didn't make it over the line. There were a group of people that I knew that put up millions of dollars of their own money for the feasibility study. And in the end, they canned the project after spending, $4 or $5 million because they were trying to do it debt financed. And they couldn't pre-sell enough capacity to get the bank funding. They didn't want to finance it all out of their own pockets because they're tight bastards. And so the project just didn't happen. They cut their losses and turned it off.
Yeah, so John is right. Having a hyperscaler on your project lends a lot of credibility. Without that, it's a very, very tough hill to climb.
We have 30 minutes left. We have 5 minutes left. So what are the last questions we all talk about? What can I pick? All right, I'm going to choose construction, Alex. Yeah.
No, I'm not the right person. Construction.
Sorry.
You're punting? We can do that. I guess I'd like to know, from a personal point of view, is that when you have a ship out in the ocean, do they continue 24/7, 365 where they're building, or do they have to take a break for typhoon season or war or something? I don't know.
Yeah, so the cable ship, the construction ship will wind up enough spool for either a specific segment or the entire cable, depending on the project milestones it has to deliver. They can carry as much as 4, 5, 6, 8, 9,000 kilometers worth of cable. Because they have three, sometimes four silos with cable, and they can pretty much go. It's a ship of about normally 50 to 80 people, let's say, and it's fully self-contained. And yeah, once it's called contract in force. Once that's signed, the supplier then is obliged to build, and that can take, depending on, you can easily build 10,000 kilometers in about 8-9 months, let's say. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Once you pay them, anything can happen. They get the first 50 million, you're good to go. You'll have your cable.
Any questions from the floor since we only have a few minutes left to this great panel?
What percentage of proposed cable systems don't even make it?
I think it depends on the specific routing as well, but I think off my head, I would say maybe 20 to 30% of the cables. Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of cables that, I mean, it was here traction at the start, but it like eventually just die off. But it's possible that like after a few years, the cable can come back online as well. So, I mean, yeah, just about 20-30% on top of my head. Yeah.
If you're really, six that I know of. Anyway, the fun thing that you can do is go back and look at Telegeography's point-in-time submarine cable maps because they all include speculative projects. So you can see, you go back to 2015, look at these cables, or you go back and you read any like news report or academic report that has a Telegeography screenshot in it, and you look and see these cables, then you can see all the ones that weren't built. There are a lot. So 20-30%, yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a running joke in the industry that only believe the cable once it's in the water. Because even after you've signed the CNMA, the construction and maintenance agreement, anything can happen. So yeah, a lot of cables don't get built. A lot more. Announcements are great, but many don't get built. What I would though say, it was a trivia, because Ganesh and I used to work in the same company before. Well, he's still there because I left. But the first hyperscaler cable was actually built, and we were a member on that system. That was the Unity cable from Japan to Los Angeles. First hyperscaler cable, 2010.
I was just going to say the joke is not when it's in the water, when it reaches the shore and it's activated. Yeah, trust me, there's a lot after that also. Right? There are some cables that they've already laid in the sea, but they just can't get I mean, I won't mention which cable, but they just can't do that finishing bit, right? Some has also reached, but they haven't got the actual license to lit it up, you know. So
Thank you. This was fun.